Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So the series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, July 21st, 1969, Neil Armstrong on a soundstage in Pasadena with Stanley Kubrick directing. No, I'm kidding. It did not happen on a soundstage. It actually happened. Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. He stepped out of the Apollo 11 lunar module at technically 2:56 a.m. Coordinated Universal Time on the 21st, which was the evening of the 20th for much of the United States, but we're doing the show on the 21st. You're already listening, so we're just going to go with it. That a man walked on the moon on this day. Let's talk about the Apollo 11 mission, the culmination of the famous declaration by JFK 8 years earlier that man would walk on the moon within the decade. And let's talk about why we don't go to the moon anymore. I'm joined, as always, by Nicole Hemmer of Columbia. Hello, Nikki.
Hello, Jody. And
our special guest all this week, Maeve Higgins, contributing writer to the New York Times. Her podcast is Mothers of Invention, one of my favorite people, and a longtime moon landing conspiracist, Maeve Higgins.
Yeah. Hi, Jody. Hi, Nikki. I'm really glad to take you both on over this controversial subject.
Fisticuffs abound.
So actually, we're not going to really talk too much. We're not going to really talk about, unless you want to bring it up, the conspiracy theory. But, I want to go through a few of the sort of interesting tidbits, maybe some of the ones that we don't remember necessarily when we think of the first moon landing, and then get to this bigger question of what it meant and whether we have moments like that. I guess we can start with one which comes up from time to time, which is, Neil Armstrong, when he stepped onto the moon, said, "This is one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." And there is a little grammatical confusion there and controversy. I don't know how you want to characterize it, Nikki, because one small step for man and one giant leap for mankind is a little redundant because man and mankind are kind of the same in that usage, right?
Yes, I don't think that this necessarily rises to the level of controversy, but I do think that I remember as a kid sort of puzzling this over in my brain because I was like, it sounds profound. I think those two things mean the exact same thing. And so the missing A is crucial to the meaning of that. But I think people still were moved and felt the momentousness of the moment, even with the little glitch in the tape there.
So he did mean a man.
Yes.
And that was his line that he had practiced. And I will say Armstrong claims that he did say and that it got, I could see it. It's plausible that between the moon and here, the word dropped out in the transmission, and I think they've done like forensic audio on it and said, oh, maybe he did sneak it in when one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind makes sense why they would want to say that.
Oh, but it's a killer because he had so much time to practice, like all that time in the spaceship, just being like, one small step for a man, mankind. And it's like such a snappy line and everything. That must have been super annoying. Like, I would regret even going to the moon if I made that kind of mistake. Just because I'm a word person.
Should have just done the whole thing over again.
Yeah, take two. Well, I mean, Kubrick, known for multiple takes. He could have just asked for another one, but no. Nikki, you want to talk about Michael Collins, who I think in our research kind of both struck us as an interesting figure in all of this?
I do want to talk about Michael Collins because, look, Neil and Buzz get all of the glory. And here's Michael Collins, who's actually piloting the command module around the moon while they're gallivanting around, like playing golf, all these different things, messing up their lines. And he's just got to kind of keep the module running so he can pick them up when they're done. And so he's vital to this moment, and yet the person who isn't remembered. And I actually think that that's super important because this doesn't happen without hundreds of people, but a lot of them don't get the glory.
Yeah, I don't know what I never heard of him, Michael Collins. I've heard of Michael Collins, the Irish freedom fighter, famous, handsome guy. But in fact, I was like fixated on him as a teenager, the big fellow, we called him. And I was always like, But this Michael Collins, I didn't realize he was just like the getaway driver. And I thought maybe they parked on the moon. Like, I don't really know what I thought, but I thought they just parked on the moon and they got out and had a great time. But there was this guy there the whole time, and like with any getaway driver, they're crucial to it. Like, they get charged with the same crime as the people doing it. So it's sad that we don't know about him.
Though there is a kind of little mythology around Collins, which I really appreciate, which is, he was circling while they were on the moon. And, there's this sort of famous line about him being the loneliest person in the history of humanity because he was, genuinely like probably more isolated than anyone has ever been ever. And actually, if you think of it, he's the only one who had that experience. Everyone else, two people walked on the moon. He's the only one who had the experience of being alone in that capsule.
Was he sulking? Was he sulking? Is that why he...
Well, he has claimed in interviews that he, loved it up there and that he felt he was thinking of other people back home and that he was engaged and he wasn't feeling like the loneliest person in the history of humanity. But
I feel like he would sulk a little.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You've got to. Yeah. I mean, it makes me think that there should be maybe there have been, but like it seems ripe for a one act play or a movie or something about the Michael Collins perspective on all of this.
Played by Liam Neeson again.
Right, because who has he played the other Michael Collins? Because then you're starting to build a nice little Michael Collins, universe over time. Let's talk about a couple other things regarding the moon landing. One other small one that's interesting given where we are right now is when these three returned to Earth, they had to quarantine for a couple weeks, and this is an interesting experience where they had this experience, and then they come back and they have to stay in isolation. The fear there was that there's potential that there were some germs on the moon that they could have brought back to the United States. And I will point out that, it's kind of remarkable that there were stricter quarantine procedures in place in 1969 for people coming back from the moon than there appear to be for people here where we know that there is a disease everywhere.
And you can just drive in from New Jersey and bring all your germs.
Well, I think that it's also interesting if you think about the way that people talked about going to the moon. It was sort of an extension of all of the kind of exploration and frontier experiences people had had on Earth. And all of those came with the discovery of new diseases that were often very deadly to the people who they either encountered or to them themselves. And so this idea that, hey, when we get to this next new frontier, there could be some deadly new germ that we bring back.
So actually, let me push you on that a little bit. I mean, do you really feel like that even by the middle of the 20th century, there is still this connection back to manifest destiny and exploration and these sort of things we think of as more in the 18th, 17th, and earlier centuries?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's so key and so core to how Americans in that era, even in the 1950s and 60s, saw themselves, right, as explorers, as conquerors of the West. And now in this Cold War, as kind of bringing that same exploratory spirit to space. I think it's entirely of a piece with this imagined American character. And then it was going quite strong in the 60s. In the 60s, I mean, Westerns are still hugely popular on television and in movies. So this is very much part of the mythology still.
And I don't think it's gone away even today. I did a podcast in the past couple of years. It was a science podcast about the colonization of Mars. And there was a NASA scientist, and it was in front of a live audience, and he got pretty carried away. And he said something like, "Of course we're going to colonize Mars. That's what we do. We're Americans."
And remember that one of Newt Gingrich's policy suggestions when he was running for president in 2012 was to have a moon colony. That's one of the things he was going to do as president. So it's still there.
Well, and this brings us, I think, to sort of the bigger ideas about where this spirit, or whatever you want to call it, or fixation is these days. I mean, the Newt Gingrich thing is interesting because he's generally mocked for something like that, whereas maybe a generation or two ago he would have been lauded for having the vision to colonize the moon.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, Newt Gingrich is mocked for a lot, but he has always had this kind of futurism, and it's not surprising that it went this way. You know, I think to the extent that there's anything like this now, it's maybe going to Mars. But even that doesn't feel like it's something that is lighting a fire in the midst of the American populace.
And it's not, down to like government programs. It's people doing like the private space race now. And I guess people do hero worship like the Elon Musks of the world, and they see them as like the white male saviors. But it's nothing on a level that it used to be. From what I understand, like the moon landing really made Americans feel proud to be American.
Yeah, and it's interesting. If you look at some of the polling around it, I mean, it certainly did. And there was like great support for space exploration and a rallying effect around the landing. And then like relatively quickly, Americans were like, we did that. Like, we're not into doing that again. Like, it was the first time. And then like within 5 years, the polling was just kind of like, this isn't that big of a priority. But it is starting to creep back up, and which is really fascinating. And so, you look, it sort of dipped into the 70s, into the early 80s. But then since then, it's grown and grown and grown. And more Americans kind of are saying NASA funding is justified. Space exploration should be a priority. So I don't know if either of you have any thoughts on space exploration specifically, or whether like in general, we are losing a sense of like these big civic unifying projects.
Well, I do think we're losing a sense of these big civic unifying projects, but that is sort of at odds with a kind of cultural yearning. Like, we've had so much science fiction about space exploration, particularly since the 1960s. Like, in the 1990s, it's the heyday of Star Trek, The Next Generation, and then all the things that would spin off after that. And I think that has fueled a desire, but it hasn't been combined with that kind of civic mindedness or government investment that such a thing would require.
But also, wasn't it just because there was a war on with Russia and a race, and it was kind of a nationalistic thing, whereas that's not the case now? Like, now, the administration is like, Russia, come through.
Yeah. But, but we are in a moment now of crisis, and certainly like in relatively early and still in the moment of this coronavirus crisis, I've actually thought a couple times about the JFK moonshot speech, and wondered whether there could have been a similar speech by Trump or whomever, and said basically like, we're going to get every American a test within X amount of time, or just like some big, bold rallying statement. And it felt like, for one of the first times in my lifetime, because of the nature of this crisis, there was an opportunity for someone to step up and say that. I think.
What about build a wall?
Oh, that was it. You think that was it?
That worked on many millions of people.
Yeah.
Including you, Nikki. She's waving her hands here and celebrating build a wall. Can't see her, but.
Yeah, well, no, we've tried. The way that the moonshot worked and the improbability of it, right? That he says in 61, we're going to send a man to the moon by the end of the decade, and then it actually happens. Suddenly it becomes this, this thing in American culture that people want to replicate because it's got so much hope and possibility and actual achievement in it. And so you hear about things like the cancer moonshot, right? That we're going to do all of these different things, but we've never had that level of government investment really in anything except for the military ever since. And without that, I think that's the thing that's the key here. Like, without that kind of actual commitment of funds, you're never going to get something like this.
Right. Although I also think, to Maeve's point, the connection to something that feels really pressing, obviously a war, but, even cancer doesn't feel like potentially something that is like, oh, we have to win this battle right now and commit to it. And again, I will say coronavirus felt that way to me, and, that maybe there was an opportunity for that. All right, let's start to wrap up. We do occasionally do these on this days, and I just want to point out one, which is that in 2011, on this same day, July 21st, the space shuttle program came to an end after 30 years, after Atlantis landed at Cape Canaveral, Florida, which to me is just like, you couldn't have picked another, just pick a different anniversary to end the thing than the day that, there's a lot of other days, even a lot of other days in July.
I feel like that's like dying on your birthday. Like, it's kind of cool, but it's really sad.
Yeah. It's maybe cool for you, but sad for everyone else.
But a nice full circle symmetry to it.
Yes, that's true. All right. We're going to leave it there. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Maeve Higgins, thanks to you. And you will be back with us for the next 2 episodes as well.
Yeah. Thanks, Jody.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Follow us on social media. We're posting a bunch of stuff on Twitter and Instagram every day, moments big and small. That's at ThisDayPod on Twitter and Instagram. You can also email us, thisdaypod@gmail.com. Coming up on Thursday, we will go way back in time to Wyoming in the late 19th century and talk about why the frontier was a place where a lot of women got the right to vote much earlier than the rest of the country. That's coming up on Thursday. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening.
So there's a foot on the moon, stepping down on the moon.
I'm at the foot of the ladder.
Armstrong is on the moon. Neil Armstrong, 38-year-old American, standing on the surface of the moon.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
I think that was Neil's quote. I didn't understand.
No, one small step for man, but I didn't get the second phrase. One of our monitors here at our space headquarters is able to hear that. We'd like to know what it was.
Surface is fine and powdery.
Radiotopia.